I watched my father sign away my inheritance on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I didn't say a single word to stop him. The pen trembled in his hand. Those same hands that used to toss me in the air when I was 6, that built my first bookshelf when I was 12, that walked me down the aisle just 4 years ago. Now they shook with the effort of forming his own signature, the blue ink wandering across the page like a drunk stumbling home. Vanessa stood behind him, one manicured hand resting on his shoulder, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "There we are, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made my teeth ache. "All done. You can rest." "It's the pain medication," Vanessa explained, her face a mask of concern. "The doctors have him on so much. Morphine, oxycodone, anti-anxiety medication for the depression. It's necessary, but it does affect his cognition." She said cognition, the way someone who's been researching medical terms would say it. Carefully, deliberately. Marcus flew in from Seattle 2 months before Dad signed the new will. He lasted 45 minutes in that house before Vanessa politely but firmly asked him to leave. "You're upsetting him," she'd said. "All these questions about his medications, about his finances. Can't you see he's suffering enough without you interrogating him?" Marcus had called me that night, furious and helpless. "She's got him so drugged up, he doesn't even know what day it is, Maya." "She's doing something. I know she is." "I know," I'd said quietly, "but knowing and proving are 2 different things." That's when I started documenting everything. Every visit, I noted the date, time, and Dad's condition, the slurred speech, the confusion. The way he'd forget he'd already asked me the same question 3 times. The tremor in his hands, the glazed look in his eyes. I started researching his medications. Vanessa had helpfully left the prescription bottles out on the kitchen counter during my visits, almost like she wanted me to see them. Morphine sulfate, 30 mg every 4 hours. Lorazepam for anxiety, 2 twice daily. Oxycodone for breakthrough pain, 10 as needed. Ambien for sleep. Zoloft for depression. The list went on. Each one FDA approved. Each one prescribed by his oncologist, Dr. Richard Chen, and each one known to affect cognitive function, especially in combination. I photographed the bottles. I made notes about dosing schedules. I started compiling medical journal articles about the cognitive effects of long-term opioid use, about how benzodiazepines like lorazepam can cause confusion and memory problems, especially in elderly patients. I also started reviewing Dad's original will, the one he'd drafted 7 years ago with his longtime attorney, Gerald Martinez. It was straightforward, his estate valued at approximately $4. $3 million, including the sale of his law practice. The downtown condo, investments and life insurance would be split equally among his 3 children. There was a provision for any future spouse to receive $200,000 and the right to live in the marital home for 1 year, but the bulk of the estate would go to us. It was fair. It was clear. It was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd spent his career advocating for justice. Then Vanessa called me 6 weeks ago, her voice bright with false casualness. "Maya, dear, your father wants to update his will. Nothing major, just some adjustments now that his circumstances have changed. Since you're an attorney, I thought you might recommend someone local." We'd hate to bother Gerald, he's so busy. My blood went cold. What kind of adjustments? "Oh, you know, just ensuring I'm taken care of. After all the caregiving, all the sacrifices I've made to my own career, your father feels terrible about what I've given up for him. He wants to make sure I'm secure. Secure. The word sat in my stomach like a stone. "Let me think about it," I said. "I'll get back to you." I called Gerald Martinez that afternoon. He was blunt in the way only a 70-year-old attorney with nothing left to prove can be. "Your father called me 3 weeks ago, Maya." Vanessa set up the call. He wanted to discuss changing his will. I asked him a series of questions. Basic things about his assets, about family members, about why he wanted to make changes. He couldn't answer half of them coherently. I told him I couldn't in good conscience help him draft a new will in his current mental state. I documented everything in my notes. "Did you tell Vanessa that?" "I did. She was displeased." Displeased. She accused me of interfering in their marriage, of being prejudiced against her because she's not the children's biological mother. Then she said they'd find another attorney who would respect Richard's wishes. They found one, of course. Nathan Prescott, a semi-retired general practice attorney who did most of his work out of his home office in the suburbs. I looked him up. 3 complaints filed with the State Bar in the last 10 years, all dismissed but all concerning questions about his diligence and attention to detail. He was 73 years old, still practicing mostly because he didn't know what else to do with himself. He was also cheap. His fee for a simple will revision, $500. That should have been Vanessa's first mistake, choosing someone so obviously inferior to Dad's long-time attorney. But I suppose when you're in a hurry to lock in an inheritance before the testator dies, you don't have the luxury of being picky. Vanessa called me 2 weeks later to tell me Dad wanted to see all of us. Family meeting, she said. He wants to discuss some important decisions. We gathered in that suburban ranch house on a grey Tuesday in March. Marcus flew in from Seattle. Jade drove up from her residency in Indianapolis, closer than Boston now that she'd started her emergency medicine training. The house smelled like lavender air freshener and something else underneath it, something clinical and sad that no amount of essential oils could cover up. Dad sat in a leather recliner in the living room, an oxygen tube in his nose, a blanket over his lap, even though the house was warm. He'd lost 30 pounds since Christmas. His skin had a yellowish tint, but his eyes lit up when he saw us. "My kids," he said, the words slightly slurred but genuine. "All my kids." We spent an hour just talking, reminiscing. Jade showed him photos of her apartment. Marcus told stories about his company's latest product launch. I talked about a case I'd just won. Dad laughed and nodded and asked questions, and for those 60 minutes he seemed almost like himself. Then Vanessa appeared with Nathan Prescott. The attorney was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and a battered leather briefcase that looked like it predated the Reagan administration. He nodded at us politely, then took a seat next to Dad's recliner. "Richard," he said loudly, as if Dad were hard of hearing rather than dying, "I've prepared the will revision as we discussed. Are you ready to review it?" What followed was a masterclass in legal malpractice. Prescott read through the new will quickly, his voice a monotone. The critical changes came in Article 3. Instead of splitting the estate 3 ways among the children, the new will left everything. 100% of the estate to Vanessa Elizabeth Holloway, in recognition of her devoted care and sacrifice during my final illness. We would each receive a token bequest of $10,000, barely enough to cover the cost of his funeral. $4.03 million gone. Redirected entirely to a woman who'd been in our father's life for just 3 years. Marcus stood up. "Dad, are you sure about this? I mean, really sure? This is a huge change." Dad looked confused, his eyes darting between Marcus and Vanessa. "Well, Vanessa has been so good, and you kids are all doing so well. We don't need the money, Dad," Jade interrupted, her voice shaking. "But that's not the point. This is about what you wanted, what you and Mom planned together. Don't you remember? You always said you wanted to make sure we were taken care of, that we could buy homes and start families, and that's enough," Vanessa snapped, her mask slipping for just a moment. Then softer, touching Dad's hand. "Darling, you're getting upset. You remember what Dr. Chen said about stress? Maybe we should take a break." "No," Dad said, and there was a flash of his old stubbornness. "No, I want to do this. Vanessa's right. She's given up everything for me." "It's only fair." Prescott cleared his throat. "If everyone's ready, Richard, I'll need you to sign here, here, and here. We have 2 witnesses." He gestured to 2 people I hadn't noticed standing in the doorway. A younger woman in scrubs, one of the home nurses, I realized, and an older man in a maintenance uniform. They'll witness your signature and sign as well, confirming that you appeared to be of sound mind when executing this will. Sound mind. I almost laughed. Dad reached for the pen, and that's when I saw his hands trembling, watched the signature wander across the page, heard him mispronounce Vanessa's middle name as he read it aloud. And I said nothing. I watched Nathan Prescott fold the will, place it in an envelope, and hand it to Vanessa with a satisfied nod. I watched Vanessa smile her sharp smile. I watched my brother storm out of the house. I watched my sister cry silent tears. And I went home and added every single detail to my documentation file. Dad died 5 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in April. Vanessa called each of us separately to tell us. She cried on the phone, her grief sounding so genuine that for a moment I almost felt guilty about what I was planning to do. The funeral was beautiful. Vanessa had planned everything. Dad's favourite hymns, flowers, even the menu for the reception afterward. She played the grieving widow perfectly, accepting condolences with grace, her black dress and pearls the picture of elegant mourning. At the reception, she pulled the three of us aside. "I know Richard's will must have been a shock," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "But I hope you'll understand that it was his wish. He wanted to take care of me. Surely you can respect that." "Of course," I said smoothly. "It was Dad's decision." She looked relieved. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. The will goes into probate next week. It should all be settled within a few months." 2 weeks later, I filed my objection to the will. The petition was 47 pages long, meticulously documented and footnoted. It outlined every medication Dad had been taking, with supporting medical literature showing their effects on cognitive function. It included statements from Dr. Chen about Dad's diminished mental capacity. It contained Gerald Martinez's notes from his conversation with Dad about changing the will. It featured expert testimony from a neuropsychologist about the combined effects of opioids and benzodiazepines on decision-making capacity. It presented a timeline showing the rapid escalation of Dad's medication in the 3 months before the new will was signed. Most importantly, it included the medical records I'd obtained through a subpoena, records showing that Dad's morphine dose had been increased to maximum levels just 2 days before Vanessa called Nathan Prescott to draft a new will. Records showing that he'd been hospitalized with confusion and delirium just 1 week before signing. Records that Vanessa had never mentioned to Prescott or the witnesses. Under Illinois law, for a will to be valid, the testator must have testamentary capacity. They must understand the nature of their assets, know who their natural heirs are, and comprehend the effect of the will they're signing. A person under the influence of medication that affects judgment doesn't have testamentary capacity, even if they appear lucid in the moment. Dad hadn't had testamentary capacity. The medical evidence was overwhelming. Vanessa fought back, of course. She hired her own attorneys, a big firm from downtown Chicago, the kind that charges $800 an hour. They argued that Dad had been clear about his wishes, that he'd wanted to provide for his devoted wife, that his children were just greedy and resentful. They accused me of elder abuse for allowing my father to be over-medicated. They suggested I'd forged documents. They tried to paint me as a bitter daughter who couldn't accept her father's love for his new wife. But here's the thing about the law. Evidence doesn't care about narrative. Facts don't bend to emotion. The probate judge, a stern woman named Judith Kowalski, who'd been on the bench for 23 years, reviewed all the evidence over a 3-day hearing. She heard from Dr. Chen, who admitted under oath that Dad's cognitive function had been significantly impaired in his final months. She heard from Gerald Martinez, who testified that he'd refused to draft a new will because Dad couldn't answer basic questions about his estate. She reviewed the medical records, the medication lists, the expert testimony. She also heard from Nathan Prescott, who admitted under cross-examination that he'd spent less than 30 minutes with Dad before having him sign the new will, that he hadn't reviewed any medical record, that he hadn't asked Dad any questions to assess his mental capacity beyond, "Do you understand what you're signing?" When I asked Prescott if Dad had been able to name his 3 children without prompting, he'd paused for a long time before saying, "I don't recall asking him that." Judge Kowalski's ruling came down 6 months after Dad's death, on a cold October morning. I still remember the key phrase in her written opinion. The court finds by clear and convincing evidence that the decedent lacked testamentary capacity at the time of executing the March 14, 2024, will due to the effects of prescription medications on his cognitive function. The will, dated March 14, 2024, is hereby declared null and void. The decedent's previous will, executed July 22, 2017, is admitted to probate as the valid last will and testament of Richard James Holloway. Dad's original will was restored. The estate would be split 3 ways, just as he'd always intended. Vanessa would receive her $200,000 and the right to live in the ranch house for 1 year, as provided in the original will. She filed an appeal, but it was denied. The evidence was too strong, the legal precedent too clear. I saw her one last time at the final probate hearing where the estate distribution was formalised. She looked smaller somehow, her platinum hair showing dark roots, her designer suit hanging a bit loose. She didn't speak to any of us. She just signed the necessary papers with a pen that didn't tremble at all, then walked out of the courthouse into a grey November afternoon. I'd wondered sometimes if I'd feel triumphant when this moment came. I'd imagined myself feeling vindicated, righteous, satisfied. Instead, I just felt tired. That night, Marcus, Jade and I met at the same Italian restaurant where we'd had dinner with Dad, and Mum on countless special occasions. We toasted to Dad with his favourite wine, a Chianti that he'd always said tasted like summer in Tuscany, even though he'd never been to Tuscany. You knew all along, didn't you? Jade said, looking at me over her wine glass. At the house when he signed that will. You knew it wouldn't hold up, so. I nodded slowly. I knew the moment I saw his medication schedule, but I had to let her think she'd won. I needed her to go through with it, to create the very evidence that would invalidate it. You could have stopped it, Marcus said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. You could have said something that day. I could have, I agreed. But if I'd challenged it then, she might have waited, changed tactics, weaned him off the meds just enough to make it harder to prove incapacity. She might have found a better attorney who would have documented his mental state more carefully. This way, she overplayed her hand. She got greedy and sloppy. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Jade raised her glass again. To Dad, she said. Who taught us that justice isn't always immediate, but it's always worth fighting for? We clinked glasses and I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not vindication. Just a quiet sense that I'd done what needed to be done, that I'd honoured both the letter and the spirit of the law Dad had devoted his life to. The thing is, I'm not proud of what I did. I'm not proud that I watched my father, confused, dying, manipulated, sign away his life's work while I sat silently. I'm not proud that I used his suffering as evidence, that I turned his medical records into ammunition. Either. I'm not ashamed either. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is smile and say nothing at all. Sometimes you have to let the game play out. Let your opponent make the moves that will ultimately defeat them. Sometimes justice requires patience. A year has passed now since that November hearing. We sold the downtown condo and split the proceeds. We set up a scholarship fund at Dad's law school in his name. We donated his law books to the public defender's office where he'd started his career. I framed his original will, the one from 2017, the one that stood up in court, and hung it in my office. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the law, for all its flaws and complications, still means something. That documents matter. That capacity matters. That justice, even when it's slow and painful and requires watching your father's dignity be stripped away piece by piece, is still worth fighting for. And a reminder that sometimes the strongest legal argument you can make is the one you never speak aloud. My father died on a Thursday, and by Friday afternoon, my stepmother had already filed his will with the probate court. The will that cut me and my brothers out of everything our family had built for 3 generations. I sat in my office at Morrison and Price, staring at the email notification from the Cook County Probate Court, and felt something cold settle into my chest. Not surprise, exactly. I'd been expecting this ever since that nightmare afternoon 6 weeks ago when Dad had signed away our inheritance with a shaking hand while Cassandra stood behind him. Stroking his hair like he was a pet, she was preparing to put down. The new will was simple, brutal in its efficiency. Everything. The family construction company worth $6, $8 million. The house in Oak Park that had been in our family since 1952. The investment accounts. The life insurance, the vintage car collection Dad had spent 40 years assembling. All of it went to Cassandra Marie Holloway, his wife of exactly 27 months. My brothers and I would each receive $5,000, enough to pay for the funeral, I suppose, if we split the cost 3 ways. I printed the document and read it 3 times, my mind automatically cataloguing every detail the way I'd been trained to do in my 8 years as a litigation attorney. The will had been drafted by someone named Patricia Vance, an attorney I'd never heard of, which was strange because Dad had used the same estate lawyer, Harold Fleming, for over 30 years. The witnesses were listed as Emma Rodriguez and James Park. I didn't recognise those names either, though the notary stamp was legitimate enough. The date jumped out at me, November 3rd, 2023, 6 weeks ago. 3 days after Dad had been released from Northwestern Memorial following what the doctors had carefully called an acute episode of delirium and confusion brought on by medication interactions. 3 days after I'd sat by his hospital bed and watched him struggle to remember my name, my phone buzzed. A text from my oldest brother Connor. Did you see it? Tell me there's something we can do. Then another from my younger brother Elliot. This is insane. We need to fight this. I set the phone down and walked to my office window. 14 floors below, Chicago rushed through its Friday afternoon routine, everyone hurrying toward their weekend plans, toward normalcy. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass and tried to remember when everything had started to fall apart. Dad had met Cassandra 3 years ago at a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. He was 69, recently widowed after Mom's long battle with Alzheimer's. Cassandra was 52, a real estate agent with a boutique firm in Lincoln Park, twice divorced, no kids. She had this way of tilting her head when she listened to you, like you were the only person in the world who mattered. Dad had fallen hard and fast. We'd all liked her at first. After watching Mom fade away for 5 years, after seeing Dad withdraw into himself, it was a relief to see him happy again. Cassandra was charming, attentive, interested in our lives. She asked Connor about his restaurant. She wanted to hear about Elliot's work with at-risk youth. She'd meet me for lunch and ask about my cases, always remembering details from previous conversations. She's good for him, Connor had said after the wedding, a small ceremony at the Botanic Garden. He deserves to be happy. The first year was fine, normal even. Family dinners, holiday gatherings, birthday celebrations. Cassandra fit into our family like she'd always been there. Then Dad got sick. It started with fatigue he couldn't shake, then the chest pain that sent him to the ER, then the diagnosis, advanced heart disease, complicated by diabetes he'd apparently been ignoring for years. The cardiologist, Dr. Patel, was blunt. Dad needed lifestyle changes, medication management, careful monitoring. At 71, with his particular combination of conditions, his prognosis was uncertain. Cassandra became his manager. She organised his medications, and there were many. Blood thinners, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, diuretics, diabetes medication, cholesterol medication, anti-anxiety medication for the depression that had crept in with the diagnosis. She coordinated his appointments, drove him to every consultation, took meticulous notes. She also gradually and methodically began cutting us out of his life. It was subtle at first. Your father's resting became her standard greeting when we called. Planned visits would be cancelled at the last minute. He wasn't feeling well, he was having a bad day. The doctor had advised limiting stress. When we did see him, he seemed increasingly confused, his words sometimes slurring, his attention drifting. It's the medications, Cassandra explained during one family dinner that she'd graciously allowed to proceed. Dr. Patel has him on so many things. They're necessary, but they do affect his mental clarity. Plus the anxiety medication, he was having panic attacks about his health. The Xanax helps, but it makes him foggy. 4 months before Dad died, Connor tried to have a serious conversation with him about the business. Holloway & Sons Construction had been Dad's life work, built from nothing by his father in 1952, expanded by Dad into one of the most respected residential construction companies in the Chicago suburbs. Connor had been working there for 15 years, essentially running operations while Dad gradually stepped back. We need to discuss succession planning, Connor had said during a visit that Cassandra had reluctantly permitted. The contracts coming up, the projects in progress, the employees who depend on us. We need to make sure everything's structured properly. Dad had looked at him with blank eyes. Succession? Are you trying to push me out of my own company? Dad, no, that's not. I think this visit is over, Cassandra had interrupted, her voice sharp. You're upsetting him. Can't you see he's not well enough for this kind of pressure? Connor had called me from his car, his voice shaking with frustration. Something's wrong, Lauren, really wrong. He's not just sick, he's out of it. And she's controlling everything, every single thing. I'd driven out to Oak Park the next day unannounced. Cassandra answered the door in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her face carefully composed into an expression of patient suffering. Lauren, this isn't a good time. I just want to see my father. He's sleeping. He had a difficult night, the medication adjustments. Then I'll wait. We'd stared at each other for a long moment, and I'd seen something shift behind her eyes, a calculation being made. Fine, come in. But please keep your voice down. The house looked different. The family photos that had covered the mantel, 3 generations of Holloways, Mom and Dad's wedding portrait, pictures of us as kids, had been replaced with new frames featuring Cassandra and Dad on various trips. The familiar clutter of Dad's life, his newspapers, his reading glasses on every surface, his collection of vintage cameras, had been organised away into invisible storage. Dad was in his recliner in the den, an oxygen tube in his nose that I'd never seen before. His skin had a greyish tinge. He'd lost weight, his cardinal sweatshirt hanging loose on his frame. Dad, he opened his eyes and it took him a moment to focus. Lauren, what are you? What day is it? It's Tuesday, Dad. How are you feeling? Tuesday, he repeated slowly, like he was testing the word. I thought it was. I'm tired. So tired. I'd knelt beside his chair, taking his hand. It felt papery, fragile. What medications are you on, Dad? Can you tell me? Medications? He'd looked confused, then vaguely toward the kitchen. Cassandra knows. She handles all that. Is so many pills. Morning, afternoon, night. She's very good about it. I'd found Cassandra in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her arms crossed. How much Xanax is he taking? That's between your father and his doctors. I'm asking as his daughter and as an attorney, how much? Her smile had been thin. 2 milligrams, 3 times a day, as prescribed by Dr. Patel for his anxiety. 6 milligrams of Xanax daily. That was a massive dose, especially for an elderly man already on multiple medications. Combined with everything else, it would absolutely affect his cognitive function. That seems excessive. Are you a doctor now, Lauren? Because I'm following medical advice. Your father was having severe panic attacks. The medication is necessary. I'd wanted to argue, to demand answers, to call Dr. Patel right then. But Cassandra had positioned herself perfectly, the devoted wife following doctor's orders to care for her suffering husband. Any challenge would make me look like the ungrateful daughter questioning legitimate medical treatment. So I'd left, and I'd started making phone calls. Dr. Patel's office wouldn't discuss Dad's care without his consent. HIPAA regulations. But his receptionist let slip that Cassandra had brought Dad in for appointments every 2 weeks, always with detailed lists of symptoms that necessitated medication adjustments. When I asked if any family members besides Cassandra had ever attended appointments, there was a long pause before the receptionist said she didn't think so. I'd called Harold Fleming, Dad's longtime attorney. Harold was 74, semi-retired, but he'd handled every legal matter for our family since before I was born. Lauren, he'd said heavily when I asked about Dad's estate planning. Said Richard wanted to update his will. I insisted on meeting with him privately, without Cassandra present, to ensure he understood what he was doing. And it was clear within 5 minutes that he wasn't competent to be making major legal decisions. He couldn't tell me the year. He thought Connor was still in high school. He couldn't remember how many grandchildren he had. When I asked him why he wanted to change his will, he just kept saying Cassandra said it was important. My heart had started pounding. What did you do? I refused to draft a new will. I told Cassandra, because she called me afterward demanding to know what happened, that I couldn't ethically help Richard make legal decisions when he clearly lacked capacity. She accused me of being disrespectful, of not understanding modern medicine, of being ageist. Then she hung up on me. Did you document this? Every word. And Lauren, I'm telling you this as someone who's known your father for 45 years. Whatever Cassandra is doing, it's not in Richard's best interest. I can't prove anything, but my gut says she's over-medicated him deliberately. I'd thanked Harold and sat in my car for a long time, my mind racing through legal scenarios, through possibilities, through the careful steps I'd need to take if I was going to challenge whatever Cassandra was planning. 2 weeks later, Dad was hospitalized with acute delirium. The ER doctor had called me directly. I was still listed as his emergency contact, something Cassandra apparently hadn't thought to change yet. Your father was brought in by ambulance, Dr. Morrison had said. Extreme confusion, disorientation, hallucinations. His wife said it came on suddenly, but his medication levels suggest a dangerous combination of sedatives and anti-anxiety medications. We're admitting him for observation and adjustment of his medication regimen. I'd met Connor and Elliot at the hospital. Cassandra was already there, playing the worried wife with an Oscar-worthy performance. Tears, wringing hands, whispered conversations with nurses. Over 3 days in the hospital, as they reduced his medications to safer levels, we watched Dad slowly emerge from the fog. By the 2nd day, he knew our names again. By the 3rd day, he was making jokes, asking about Connor's restaurant and Elliot's kids. He looked confused about how he'd gotten there, what had been happening. I feel like I've been asleep for months, he'd said to me quietly when Cassandra had stepped out to take a call. Everything's been so fuzzy, like watching life through frosted glass. The medications were too strong, Dad. They're adjusting them. He'd squeezed my hand. I'm glad you're here, sweetheart. You and your brothers. I've missed you guys. Feels like I haven't seen you in forever. The discharge papers included strict instructions about medication management and a recommendation for a follow-up with a geriatric psychiatrist to assess his cognitive function and mental health. Dr. Morrison had pulled me aside before we left. Your father's medication regimen was dangerously high. I've sent recommendations to his cardiologist, but you should monitor this carefully. Medication errors, whether accidental or intentional, can be devastating in elderly patients. Intentional, the word had hung in the air between us. 3 days after his discharge, 3 days after we'd seen glimpses of our real father returning, Cassandra had taken him to meet with Patricia Vance to sign the new will. Now Dad was dead, massive heart attack in his sleep, and that will was the only thing standing between us and losing everything our family had built. I called my senior partner, Margaret Morrison, no relation to the heir doctor, though I joked about it. Margaret had been practicing estate litigation for 32 years. She'd seen every variation of family warfare that could play out in probate court. I need to contest a will, I told her. Your father's? How did you know? You've been distracted for months. And you asked to borrow my copy of successful will contests in Illinois last week. I can put 2 and 2 together. Her voice softened. Tell me everything. I spent 2 hours in her office laying out the whole story. The medication levels, Harold Fleming's refusal to draft the new will, the hospitalization, the suspicious timing, Patricia Vance's name I'd never heard before. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on her legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Do you want my professional opinion or my personal opinion? Both. Professionally, you have grounds to contest this will on the basis of lack of testamentary capacity and possibly undue influence. The timing is suspicious, the medical evidence is compelling, and Harold Fleming's testimony about refusing to draft a will could be powerful. But these cases are expensive, emotionally draining, and they tear families apart. And personally, Margaret set down her pen and looked at me directly. Personally, I think your stepmother deliberately over-medicated your father to keep him confused and compliant. Probably waited for the perfect window after his hospitalization when he was still impaired, but technically out of medical care. Then rushed him to sign a will with an attorney who either didn't know or didn't care about his mental state. And personally, I think you should fight like hell. The next morning, I filed a formal objection to Dad's will with the probate court. A will contest in Illinois requires proving one of several things: lack of testamentary capacity, undue influence, fraud, or improper execution. I was going after capacity, arguing that Dad hadn't understood what he was signing because of his medication-impaired mental state. My petition was 63 pages long, including exhibits. I attached Dad's hospital records from his delirium admission. I attached a sworn affidavit from Harold Fleming detailing his conversation with Dad and his refusal to draft a new will. I attached medical literature about the cognitive effects of benzodiazepines like Xanax, particularly in elderly patients with multiple health conditions. I attached Dr. Patel's medication records showing the escalating doses of sedatives Dad had been on. Most importantly, I attached the discharge instructions from Northwestern Memorial, dated November 1st, 2023, just 2 days before the new will was signed, which explicitly noted patient exhibited severe confusion and disorientation due to medication toxicity and recommended careful monitoring of medication regimen and cognitive status. 2 days. Cassandra had waited just 2 days after Dad was discharged with documented severe confusion before taking him to sign away his entire estate. Cassandra hired a law firm I recognized, Whitmore and Associates, one of the most aggressive litigation firms in Chicago. They charged $600 an hour and had a reputation for scorched earth tactics. Their response to my petition was exactly what I expected. Aggressive denial, personal attacks, and an attempt to paint me and my brothers as greedy children who couldn't accept our father's love for his wife. According to their filing, Dad had been of sound mind and clear intentions when he signed the will. Patricia Vance would testify that she'd asked Dad appropriate questions, and he'd answered coherently. The witnesses, Emma Rodriguez and James Park, would confirm he seemed to understand what he was signing. Cassandra would testify about Dad's clear and repeated wishes to provide for her after all her devoted caregiving. They also accused me of having a personal vendetta against Cassandra because I'd never accepted her as my father's wife and suggested my objection was motivated by greed and resentment rather than any legitimate legal concern. That stung more than I expected, not because it was true, but because I knew how it would look to an outsider. Adult children fighting over their inheritance rarely came across sympathetically. The discovery phase of will contests is brutal. Everything becomes evidence. Every email, every text message, every medical record, every witness statement. Both sides digging through the deceased's life, looking for ammunition. I subpoenaed Dad's complete medical records from the past 2 years. The story they told was damning. His Xanax prescription had started at 0.5 mg as needed, standard for situational anxiety. Over 18 months, it had been increased to 2 and 3 times daily, a massive dose. Each increase had been requested by Cassandra during appointments, citing worsening anxiety symptoms. But here was the interesting part. The prescription increases always came shortly after Cassandra had reported new symptoms to Dr. Patel. And they always came during appointments when Dad seemed particularly confused or distressed. The perfect opportunity to argue he needed more medication. I hired a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Rachel Nguyen, to review the records. Her expert opinion was devastating to Cassandra's case. Based on the medical records, Richard Holloway was significantly cognitively impaired during the period when the contested will was executed. The combination and dosage of benzodiazepines, particularly following a documented episode of medication-induced delirium just days earlier, would have substantially affected his ability to understand complex legal decisions. In my professional opinion, he lacked testamentary capacity on November 3rd, 2023. We also deposed Patricia Vance, the attorney who drafted the new will. The deposition was conducted in a conference room at Whitmore and Associates, with Cassandra's lawyers present and clearly coaching their witness during breaks. "Miss Vance," I asked, "how long did you spend with Richard Holloway before he signed the will?" "Approximately 45 minutes. And how did he seem to you during that time?" "He seemed fine, a bit quiet, but coherent." "Did you ask him any questions to assess his mental capacity?" "I asked if he understood what we were doing, and he said yes." "Did you ask him to name his children?" A pause. "I don't recall specifically asking that." "Did you ask him to describe his assets?" His wife had provided a list of assets. "Did you ask him to confirm that list was accurate?" Another pause, longer this time. "I may have. I don't remember exactly, Miss Vance, were you aware that Mr. Holloway had been hospitalized with severe confusion and delirium just 2 days before you met with him?" "No, I was not." Did you ask about his recent medical history? I asked if he had any health concerns that would prevent him from executing a will. And what did he say? His wife said he was fine. I asked what he said, not what his wife said. Patricia Vance shifted in her seat. I don't recall him saying anything specifically. Was Mrs. Holloway present for the entire meeting? Yes. Did Mr. Holloway speak more, or did she? More, or did she? The attorney looked at Cassandra's lawyers, who were already opening their mouths to object, but Patricia answered first. She did most of the talking. But that's not unusual with elderly clients who have involved caregivers. I let that sit for a moment. Did you ask to speak with Mr. Holloway alone at any point? No. Why not? I didn't feel it was necessary. Even though you were helping him draft a will that completely disinherited his 3 children and left his entire estate to a wife he'd been married to for less than 2.5 years. Objection, one of Cassandra's lawyers interjected. Argumentative. I'll rephrase. Ms. Vance, did it strike you as unusual that Mr. Holloway wanted to leave everything to his wife and nothing to his children? People structure their estates in many different ways. Had you ever met Mr. Holloway before November 3rd? No. Did you know what his previous will said? No. Did you ask? No. So you had no idea that you were helping him completely reverse his lifetime estate plan without ever asking him why? Her lawyer objected again, but I'd made my point. We also deposed Emma Rodriguez and James Park, the witnesses who'd signed the will. Emma was a home health aide who'd worked for Cassandra, not for Dad. For Cassandra, doing housekeeping and occasional errands. James was a maintenance worker at Cassandra's real estate office. Neither had ever met Dad before the day they witnessed his signature. Did he seem confused? I asked Emma. He seemed tired, kind of out of it. Did he speak? Not really. Mrs. Holloway did most of the talking. Did you have any concerns about whether he understood what he was signing? I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I just signed where they told me to sign. The probate trial was set for 6 months after I filed the objection. 6 months of discovery, depositions, expert witnesses, and mounting legal bills. Connor and Elliot split the costs with me. We'd spent nearly $75,000 by the time we walked into court. Judge Raymond Torres was 62, a former criminal prosecutor who'd been on the probate bench for 8 years. He had a reputation for being fair but impatient with bullshit. The trial lasted 4 days. Cassandra's lawyers argued that Dad had been clear and coherent, that he'd wanted to provide for his devoted wife, that my brothers and I were successful adults who didn't need his money. They presented Patricia Vance, who testified that Dad had seemed fine to her. Tida. They presented the witnesses, who said he'd signed voluntarily. Then Cassandra took the stand. She cried on cue, talking about how much she'd loved Dad, how much she'd sacrificed to care for him, how devastated she was that his children were attacking her when she was just respecting his wishes. Did your husband ever tell you he wanted to leave everything to you? Her lawyer asked. All the time. He said I'd given up everything to care for him, that I'd earned it. Did he ever express any negative feelings about his children? He was disappointed that they didn't visit more, but they seemed more interested in the business than in him. I watched Connor's jaw clench beside me. Then it was our turn. I put Harold Fleming on the stand first. He was calm, authoritative, credible. He described his 45-year relationship with Dad, his concern about Dad's condition when Cassandra tried to have the will changed, his explicit refusal to draft a new will because of Dad's obvious incapacity. Mr. Fleming, I asked, in your professional opinion, did Richard Holloway have the mental capacity to execute a will in November 2023? Absolutely not. The man I spoke with couldn't tell me what year it was. That's not a person who should be making irrevocable legal decisions about millions of dollars beyond billions of dollars. And Dr. Nguyen testified about the medical records, about medication effects, about the documented delirium, just days before the will was signed. She walked the judge through every medication, every dosage, every warning label. In your expert opinion, Dr. Nguyen, did Richard Holloway have testamentary capacity on November 3rd, 2023? No. The medical evidence is clear. He was significantly impaired. Then I put Dr. Morrison, the ER doctor, on the stand. He testified about Dad's condition when he was hospitalized. about the dangerous medication levels, about his concerns. Did you have any impression about how Mr. Holloway had come to be on such high doses of medication? Cassandra's lawyer objected immediately, but Dr. Morrison had already started answering. I noted in my report that the medication regimen raised concerns. It's unusual for escalation to happen so quickly without corresponding medical necessity. We played portions of Dad's hospital stay recordings. Illinois is a one-party consent state, and Connor had recorded some of Dad's conversations during lucid moments. In one recording, Dad talked about feeling like he'd been asleep for months, about missing his kids, about feeling confused all the time. Finally, I took the stand myself. I testified about the gradual isolation, about the medication increases, about the suspicious timing. I kept my voice steady, professional, even when Cassandra's lawyer tried to rattle me by implying I was motivated by greed. Miss Holloway, he said, using my married name with particular emphasis, you stand to inherit over $2 million if this will is overturned. The state bar had opened an investigation into her conduct. I doubted she'd lose her license, but it would follow her. I thought about Dr. Patel, who'd kept increasing Dad's medications based solely on Cassandra's reports, without adequately assessing Dad himself. He'd been more careful than Patricia Vance. He'd documented everything, followed protocols, but he'd also trusted a wife who shouldn't have been trusted. Mostly, though, I thought about Dad, about the man he'd been before Cassandra, before the medications, before the fog had descended. The man who taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The probate war was over. We'd won back what was rightfully ours. But the real victory wasn't the money or the house or even the company. The real victory was knowing that in the end, justice had prevailed. That Dad's true wishes, the ones he'd expressed clearly and competently when he was himself, had been honoured. That had to be enough. And somehow, driving through the Chicago night with the courthouse behind me and my father's memory beside me, it was.